Get out of my house." My father didn't raise his voice when he said it. That was what made it worse. He stood in the doorway holding a glass of expensive whiskey, his posture rigid and cold, while my worn-out suitcase sat at my feet on the polished marble floor. My stepmother watched from behind him, hiding a faint, smug smile she thought I didn't notice. The hallway felt suddenly too small, suffocating with years of unspoken resentment. Then he said the words that changed everything. "You're getting nothing from me, not the house, not the company, not a single cent." He thought he was destroying me. He looked at me with such absolute disdain, clearly believing that stripping me of my inheritance and my home was the ultimate punishment. He wanted me to crawl back, begging for his forgiveness, broken and penniless. He stood there, the master of his domain, thinking he had won the war he'd been fighting against me for years. But he was so wrong. He had no idea what was already hidden. He didn't know that my silence over the last few years wasn't weakness. It was a tactical retreat. He was about to find out that when you take everything from someone, you have to be very sure they don't have a backup plan. I wasn't a rebellious son. I wasn't a failure who spent his nights in bars or his days racing cars. I was the one who stayed. I worked until my hands bled. I helped manage the accounts when my father was too busy playing golf. I protected the family business while my younger half-brother, Leo, spent money like water, treating the company credit card as if it were a bottomless pit of gold. I did it because I believed in the legacy. I believed that if I proved my worth, my father would eventually see me for who I was. But in my father's eyes, blood had started to matter differently after he remarried. The dynamic in the house shifted the day he brought Elena home. Suddenly, I wasn't a hard-working son anymore. I was a competitor. I was a reminder of his first marriage, a ghost of a past he wanted to bury. I realized too late that he didn't want a successor. He wanted a servant. And when I stopped serving, I became an obstacle. It was a painful realization, but it was the first step toward my true awakening. I had been playing by the rules of a game where the board was rigged against me. At first, the changes were small and subtle, the kind of things you might dismiss as mere forgetfulness. Locked office doors that used to be open, conversations that stopped abruptly when I walked into the room, missing files that I specifically remembered placing on my desk, signatures on documents that I didn't remember approving, yet there were my initials perfectly forged. Something felt deeply wrong, a persistent itch at the back of my neck, but no one would say it aloud. The staff at the office, the loyal assistants who had known me since I was a boy, started avoiding my eyes. They looked terrified, as if they knew a storm was coming but were too scared to warn me. I felt like I was living in a house of mirrors, where everything looked familiar, but nothing was what it seemed. I started keeping a private log of everything. The times I was locked out, the documents that went missing, the strange phone calls. I was being isolated, systematically cut off from the very company I had helped build. It was clear that someone was preparing to bury me. I just didn't know how deep the hole was. My stepmother, Elena, never fought directly. She was far too intelligent for that. She whispered, small, poisonous things, planted like seeds in my father's ear. "He seemed so resentful lately," she would say over dinner, her voice soft and full of fake concern. "He looks angry, Marcus. Are you sure he's loyal?" Or, "I worry about his influence on Leo. He seems to be leading him down the wrong path." She didn't need to scream or throw tantrums. She just had to create a narrative of doubt. And slowly, she turned my father against me without ever raising her voice. It was a masterful performance of manipulation. My father, already prone to paranoia as his empire grew, soaked it all up. He began to look at me not as his son, but as a potential traitor. Every success I had at work was met with suspicion, and every minor mistake was treated as evidence of my incompetence. I watched, helpless, as the man who used to trust me with his life began to view me as a threat to his precious kingdom. It was cold, calculated, and devastating. My half-brother, Leo, smiled like he knew something, but his eyes were always darting around the room, betraying his nervousness. He acted careless, spoiled, and completely harmless, as if he were just a kid playing with toys. But every time my father questioned me about some trivial matter, my brother looked away too quickly, his face flushing. That's when I realized he wasn't clueless. He was involved. He was a golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and he was being groomed to take my place. He played the part of the devoted son perfectly. While behind my back, he was feeding Elena information to keep the fire burning. It was a family conspiracy, a tag team effort to push me out of the picture. I felt a surge of betrayal, so sharp it physically hurt. I had helped Leo with his schoolwork, covered for him when he stayed out too late, and defended him against my father's wrath. And this was how he repaid me. He was a shadow behind the curtain, waiting for my final collapse so he could step into the light. I had been foolish to think he was just a kid. He was an accomplice. The first real red flag appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when I was checking a routine company account. A six-figure transfer had been moved offshore to a shell corporation I didn't recognize. Under my authorization, my signature, my login, my credentials. It was all there, clear as day, but I hadn't touched it. I hadn't authorized any transfers in weeks. My hands started to shake as I looked at the digital trail. It was a setup, a perfect trap designed to ruin me. If anyone audited these accounts, I would be the one held responsible for the theft. It was criminal activity, clear and simple. I realized in that they weren't just trying to get me fired. They were trying to send me to prison. The fear hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't go to my father because he would only blame me. I couldn't go to the police because I had no proof that I wasn't the one who did it. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own family's making. I had to find a way to protect myself, and I had to do it quickly. I started digging, and I found a scanned contract that chilled my blood. It was a legal transfer document, perfectly crafted. It showed that I had voluntarily surrendered my ownership shares in the family business. My name was there, typed in a familiar font. My signature was there, a perfect replica of my own. But I had never seen the paper before in my life. Someone had forged everything, from the notary stamp to the witness signatures. It was so professional that I almost doubted my own memory. I went back to my private log and realized that this wasn't just a one-time thing. It was part of a larger plan to strip me of everything I owned. They were systematically deleting me from the company's history. I felt like a ghost, fading away while the people who were supposed to love me orchestrated my destruction. I was being erased, and the worst part was that I didn't know who else was involved. I had to assume that everyone in the office was compromised. I was completely on my own. When I finally gathered the courage to confront my father, he stared at me like a complete stranger. I showed him the forged documents, my voice trembling with the effort to stay calm. He didn't even look at them. He just stared at me with icy indifference. "You're lying," he said, his voice flat. "You've always been jealous of Leo. You're trying to ruin this company because you can't handle the pressure. That hurt more than being thrown out." Because he didn't even hesitate. He didn't ask for an explanation. He didn't look for the truth. He chose him instantly, without a second thought. It was the ultimate betrayal. He had already made up his mind, and no amount of evidence was going to change it. He was blinded by his own arrogance and the web of lies Elena had woven around him. I left the study feeling utterly defeated, knowing that the man I had spent my life trying to impress was lost to me forever. He wasn't the father I remembered. He was just a shell of a man driven by greed and bitterness. That night, I overheard the truth. The house was quiet, and I was walking past my father's study when I heard their voices, low and conspiratorial. My stepmother wanted me gone before my father's health declined, because she knew something I didn't. My father was dying. The realization hit me like a freight train. He was suffering from a terminal illness, and Elena was scrambling to secure every asset before he was gone. She wanted to ensure that she and Leo would be the sole heirs, leaving me with nothing but the dust of his empire. My heart ached for my father. Despite everything he had done to me, he was dying, and he was being manipulated by the very people who were supposed to care for him. I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't about me. It was about survival for them. They were vultures, picking apart a dying man's legacy, and I was just the final obstacle they needed to remove. I felt a cold anger replace my grief. I wasn't going to let them win. What they didn't know was that years earlier, my grandfather had trusted only me, not my father, not anyone else. He was a man of integrity, and he had seen the rot starting to take hold of my father's heart long before I ever did. He left me something quietly, a sealed trust, a secret safety net that he created specifically for me. It was a document he had drafted in his final days, hidden away from everyone. My father never knew it existed, because my grandfather knew that if he did, he would have done everything in his power to destroy it. It was a masterfully constructed instrument, one that controlled far more than just the family home or the business profits. It was a legacy of power, designed to protect the future, and my grandfather had placed it squarely in my hands. I was the guardian of the family's true soul. They thought they had everything, but they were playing with stolen goods. I held the real power, and they had absolutely no idea. Inside an old, dusty watch box my grandfather had given me for my 18th birthday was a key, a heavy, antique bank key. I had never used it. I had never needed to. I thought it was just a sentimental trinket, a reminder of the man I had looked up to my entire life. But until the night I became homeless, I had no reason to investigate it. When I was forced out, I remembered his words. This key will open more than a box, son. It will open your eyes to the truth when the world seems to have forgotten. I had kept the box with me, hidden in the bottom of my suitcase, through every move and every struggle. I pulled it out that night in the motel, my hand shaking. I looked at the key, feeling the weight of my grandfather's trust. I realized that my survival depended on whatever was inside that box. I was terrified of what I might find, but I knew I had to face it. I was ready to unlock the truth, no matter what it cost. I went to the bank the next morning, my heart hammering against my ribs. I presented the key to the clerk, who led me to a private, dimly lit room. Inside the safety deposit box was everything I needed to reclaim my future. There were original ownership papers that proved the family company was never legally my father's alone. There were handwritten letters detailing his early crimes and his hidden bank accounts. There were financial ledgers that showed decades of tax fraud and illegal kickbacks. And sitting on top of everything was one video file, a small, flash drive recording of my grandfather. My throat went dry. I took everything home, my mind racing. The contents of the box were a death sentence for my father's empire and a life-saving miracle for me. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the ammunition I needed to fight back. I sat on my bed, staring at the evidence, and for the first time in months, I felt truly powerful. The game had just shifted in my favor. I played the video file, and my grandfather's face filled the screen. He looked directly into the camera, his expression grave and determined. "If you're watching this, your father betrayed this family," he began. Then he explained everything. He had seen the greed growing in my father years ago, and he had spent his final years meticulously building a backup plan that only I could access. He talked about the values of honesty and hard work, and how my father had abandoned them for the lure of easy money and absolute control. He warned me that if I was watching this, it meant my father had finally turned on me, just as he had turned on the family's principles. "Don't let the greed consume you, too," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Use what I have given you to set things right. The truth is your greatest weapon, and justice is your only goal." What he said made my hands shake. I realized then that my grandfather hadn't just left me money. He had left me a mission. I did the math, and the realization was staggering. My father thought he owned the company, but he didn't. Through a series of brilliant, layered trusts that my grandfather had established, I quietly held a controlling interest. He had spent years trying to throw me out of a company that was legally mine. He had been a puppet this whole time, and I was the one pulling the strings, even if I hadn't known it. I sat back and let it sink in. All the years of abuse, the accusations, the exile, it was all based on a lie that my father told himself. He was a desperate man pretending to be a king, and he had kicked out the true heir. The irony was almost poetic. I had the power to fire him, to take back the mansion, and to strip him of every single asset he had built his life on. But I wasn't going to do it out of anger. I was going to do it to ensure that the legacy my grandfather intended was finally restored. I said nothing. I didn't call. I didn't fight. I didn't warn them. That was the hardest part, the silence. It was like holding a live grenade and waiting for the right moment to pull the pin. I watched from afar as they went about their lives, celebrating their victory, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to crack open. I saw them on the news, attending galas and making promises about the company's future, their faces full of arrogance and pride. It would have been so easy to leak everything early, to start the collapse right away. But I knew better. Revenge works better when people feel safe first. I wanted them to believe they had won, to reach the peak of their ego before I kicked the ladder out from under them. I wanted them to experience the true cost of their betrayal. So I kept my silence, working in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was a test of patience, and I passed it with a cold, iron resolve. I hired a forensic accountant, someone who specialized in unraveling complex financial crimes, then an attorney, a pit bull who knew my father's lawyers better than they knew themselves, then a private investigator, someone who could find a secret in a locked room. Every fake transfer, every forged signature, every hidden account, we tracked them down. The deeper we dug, the uglier it became. It wasn't just small thefts. It was systemic, institutional fraud on a massive scale. My father wasn't just a businessman. He was a criminal mastermind who had spent his career cheating his way to the top. I saw the documents that prove he had bribed city officials to win government contracts and how he had laundered millions through offshore accounts. My blood boiled as I read the evidence. It was all so simple, yet so devastatingly effective. They thought they had covered their tracks, but they hadn't realized that the truth is rarely as buried as they think. I was building a cage for them, one file at a time. The biggest betrayal hit me when I looked at the offshore accounts. The money wasn't just general company funds or profits from shady deals. It was life insurance money. My mother's life insurance. The money that was meant for me after she passed away when I was a child. My father had stolen that too, funneling it into his personal accounts before I was even old enough to understand what a bank account was. The cruelty of it took my breath away. He had used my own mother's death to fund his rise to power. It was a level of depravity I hadn't thought him capable of. I felt a cold, sharp focus settle over me. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about honoring my mother's memory. I was going to make sure he paid for every cent he had stolen from her. The betrayal was no longer just professional. It was deeply personal, and I was going to use every legal tool at my disposal to ensure he suffered the consequences. The private investigator uncovered messages that went back years, long before I even suspected anything was wrong. My stepmother had planned everything for years. Even before marrying my father, she had targeted him for his money from the very beginning. The investigator found emails detailing how she had researched his finances, his weaknesses, and his ego long before they were even introduced. She had used me as a scapegoat, grooming the situation so that when the time was right, she could point the finger at me and have my father agree. She was a master manipulator, a woman who treated people like chess pieces. And my father had fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. I felt a strange sense of pity for him now, too. He was a monster, but he was also a fool. He had wanted a partner in his empire, and he had ended up with a parasite. They deserved each other, and soon they would have to face the results of their combined greed. 3 weeks later, they called an emergency board meeting. It was a final step in their plan, the moment they intended to formally remove me from the company's articles of incorporation and strip me of any remaining legal standing. I arrived early, walking into the boardroom wearing the same suit my father had bought me years ago, the one I had worn to my first day of work. They all looked at me with varying degrees of shock and confusion, clearly expecting me to be cowering in a motel somewhere. They were confident, almost smug, as they sat around the table, waiting for the vote to pass. And for the first time, I smiled. It was a genuine, terrifying smile. They didn't know what was coming. They thought they were the predators, but they were the ones who were trapped. I sat down at the head of the table, the place my father usually occupied, and watched them scramble. The board was full of my father's yes men, but they were about to get a reality check. I was finally ready to play my hand. The room went silent as my lawyer placed the trust documents on the table. They were heavy, official, and undeniable. My father looked at them, his face turning pale. He knew what they were before he even opened them. Then, at my signal, the video of my grandfather started playing on the main conference screen. His face appeared, larger than life, a ghost from the past coming back to haunt them. By the end of the recording, no one in the room could look at my father. The silence was thick, suffocating. The board members, who had spent years doing his bidding, were now staring at the table, terrified of what this meant for them. They had supported a man who had lied to them, stolen from them, and betrayed their trust. I watched as the reality of the situation washed over them. My father was no longer the king. He was a criminal, and his kingdom had just collapsed. I had turned the entire room against him in 10 minutes. It was the best feeling of my life. Then came the forensic report. My accountant went through the evidence, detailing every single count of forgery, embezzlement, tax fraud, and insurance fraud. The numbers were staggering, and the documents were irrefutable. My father's hands started shaking so violently he had to hide them under the table. My stepmother stopped breathing, her face a mass of pure terror. My brother, Leo, finally understood what was happening. He looked at me with eyes wide with horror, realizing that his comfortable, pampered life was about to be obliterated. Too late. They realized they were trapped in the web they had built. The room was no longer filled with the arrogance of powerful people. It was filled with the panic of corner criminals. They had thought they were untouchable, but they were about to face the full force of the law. I watched the scene with a cold, detached satisfaction. This was justice, pure and simple. They were being dismantled, piece by piece, right before my eyes. After the meeting ended in a chaotic flurry of accusations and denials, my father found me in the parking garage. He looked broken, his expensive suit hanging on him like a shroud. For the first time in my life, he looked small. He didn't have his bluster. He didn't have his money. He just looked like a tired, old man. He said, "I was going to fix it, son. I just needed more time. Everything I did for the family." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no love, not even anger anymore. I just felt relief that it was over. I told him that some damage simply can't be repaired, and that he had traded his soul for a kingdom that was never actually his to begin with. He reached out as if to grab my arm, but he stopped when he saw the look in my eyes. He was a stranger to me, and I was finally, truly free of his influence. The father I had once worshipped was gone, replaced by the man who had tried to destroy me. I looked at him and said, "You already chose your new family, Marcus. You made your bed. Now you have to lie in it." Then I reached into my bag and handed him the same suitcase he had left by the door for me, the one that had sat there for so long while I struggled to survive. It was a symbolic gesture, a reminder of the night he thought he had won. He looked at the suitcase as if it were a bomb. I didn't wait for him to respond. I just turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing in the silence of the parking garage. I didn't look back. I didn't care if he cried, if he screamed, or if he just collapsed. He had made his choices, and he had to live with them. I was going home to start a life that didn't include him, and for the first time, the future felt bright. I had reclaimed my name, my reputation, and my freedom. I was the master of my own life now, and I was going to live it the right way. Poetic justice arrived in waves. My stepmother disappeared the next day, fleeing to a country without an extradition treaty, leaving my father to face the music alone. My brother, Leo, was forced to move out of his apartment and find a job. His bank account frozen along with my father's. The board removed my father from the company the very next morning, and the authorities opened a full-scale criminal investigation that would likely keep him behind bars for years. And the home he threw me out of, the one I had been raised in, the mansion that was supposed to be the symbol of his power, it legally belonged to the trust, which meant it belonged to me. I had the keys, the title, and the power to do whatever I wanted with it. I stood in front of the gate, looking at the house where I had been betrayed, and I felt a sense of immense, quiet power. I had won, and I had done it by playing a long game, just like my grandfather had taught me. I never moved back into that mansion. Some houses carry too many ghosts, and I didn't want the memories of my father's betrayal haunting my every waking hour. I sold it, donating the proceeds to charities my mother had loved. I started over in a city where no one knew my name, building a career based on principles I actually believed in. I never married Elena, and I never saw Leo again. Sometimes I still think about that night in the hallway, the night he looked at me and said, You're getting nothing. I realize now that he was trying to use those words to break me, to make me believe that I was nothing without him. But the only thing he got wrong was believing I had nothing. I had the truth, I had my integrity, and I had the strength to stand on my own. And that, I realized, was more than enough. I was finally free, and I was never, ever looking back. The story of this air was over, and the story of my life had finally, truly begun.